Interagency collaboration is really embedded in the law, both in the Rehabilitation Act, ADA, and in IDEA. And both of these federal requirements state that the school will work with the state to plan and coordinate all of the different agencies that will work with the student in a post-secondary fashion. So this includes everything from rehabilitation services to Social Security to any sort of state agency that might be involved in terms of mental health or career planning. It's important to remember that when a child is in school, they are covered under IDEA or IDEIA. And once they graduate, that portion of the law no longer pertains to them. IDEA is only for school-age children. So while they are in school, they may be covered partially by the Rehab Act and IDEA. Once they leave, the IDEA portion kind of falls to the wayside. There's other legislation and other laws that are also applicable to students with disabilities when we're talking about transition services, everything from the Carl D. Perkins Vocational and Technology Education Amendments, which we've talked about here and there sporadically throughout the semester, ADA, American Disabilities Act, the 504 section of the Rehabilitation Act, which is we mentioned in the very beginning part of this particular PowerPoint, and other work incentives and acts that have been put in place through the years. Some of these have been reauthorized, some of them just kind of sit the way that they are, but there are a number of different components that are covering students who are transitioning out into adulthood. Just to clarify and make sure that we're all on the same page, when we're talking about interagency collaboration, we're talking about a relationship between two or more individuals or organizations that are working on a common goal. So usually this is going to be the school and the folks from Medicaid, or perhaps we're looking at a group home and the employer, or the school and the employer. So any of those types of relationships is what we would consider to be an interagency collaboration. One of the more challenging components of interagency collaboration is the issue of funding. So many of the different agencies and organizations are funded through different sources. IDEA is funding students through the schools, but then you have other acts that are funding things like Medicaid or group homes or through Social Security, and that money is coming from an entirely different place. So it's really important when you're working with folks on transition planning, if you don't have a transition coordinator, you need to be aware of what the local policies are in terms of paperwork for each of the agencies, what kind of overlap they'll have. Sometimes if you're getting funds from one source, it'll negate the opportunity to get funds from another source. So if you're working with these students, you just need to have a working knowledge of the local and state policies on how all these agencies work together, especially as it relates to funding. So what's interesting is that we spend all this time in an educational setting doing all this planning. We spend, sometimes upwards of 6 years planning for this post-secondary life that a student is going to have. But interestingly, a lot of the agencies that these students are going to be working with in a post-secondary setting, instead of really finding supports to prevent difficulties, most of them are designed to address problems that have already occurred. So this means that instead of looking at a wide range of solutions, the providers are really just concentrating on a single solution to a very specific problem. And so that doesn't really help long term. So what the providers will do is they'll concentrate on what they're able to provide and not sometimes on what the client needs. So the families need to have an understanding of what their needs are and then match that up with the agencies. If you can imagine going to any place to get any type of service, you may go somewhere and ask for a specific service and they just may not say, we don't provide that here. They're not going to troubleshoot for you necessarily and tell you where to go find that help. They're just going to tell you they don't do it. So it's important also to understand that these services that are going to be used in post-secondary settings, these agencies have very distinct purposes, and you need to know what those purposes are so that you can get a good match with the needs of the student. Collaboration with these agencies is vital in terms of understanding how they're all working together, because when these agencies are competing for very scarce resources, particularly funding, you need to make sure that you understand the dynamics between them. So again, make sure that, if you're working with students who are going to be transitioning and you're using those agencies, that you've done some research and you have a good understanding. And hopefully you have a transition specialist who is working exclusively with a student and has a better understanding of all these different components. But it's important to familiarize yourself with them so that you don't run into this problem of not finding the resources that you need. This is a small snapshot of some of the different organizations when we're talking about interagency collaboration that you might be working with. The possibilities are endless, and as you can imagine, more heavily populated areas tend to have more options than those that are less populated or in areas that don't have a large base for funding. One of the things I want to take a moment to touch on is guardianship. Guardianship becomes really important if you have a student who has severe disabilities and who cannot or will not be able to make their own decisions even when they turn 18 because of their mental capacity or because a disability that is so severe that it hinders their decision-making skills. So what will need to happen is there needs to be a process that the parents go through to transfer all those decision-making rights. And there's a number of options that are available to parents, but it does have to take place through the court system, and it needs to take place well in advance, because what happens if a parent does not apply for that guardianship before they turn 18, if a student turns 18, the student can then, hypothetically, stop coming to school or discontinue all their services. They could make any number of decisions. And if they don't have the ability or the skills to do those things, obviously the repercussions could be pretty severe. So this is a process that has to start really early. There is a document on campus. It is not from Virginia, but it is pretty thorough that explains the idea of guardianship and some of the options that are available for parents. The next couple slides also detail some of the specifics about applying for Social Security and work incentives. And these are all also things that have to happen through a process with the student and with the parents. Some of the numbers may be off just a little bit. I need to update some of the monthly fees, but the process is more or less the same. So you'll see again that magic number of 18, which we all know so well, but that's when a lot of these things kick in. So a child could potentially, still be in school, but if a parent hasn't applied for that guardianship, then all this transfers over to the student and it becomes the student's responsibility to do all of these components. So take a look at all that information about Social Security benefits and about some of the work incentives and all those components that are involved there. once you start doing some transition planning and you're reaching out to agencies and finding agencies that work for particular students, you will see that there is a little bit of comprehensiveness to the whole kind of program. Each agency has its own job and there's a place for everything. Um, so it's just important to make sure that you kind of get those services down and figure out how to meet the needs of the family and really focus on the whole family. Focus on um, you know what the parents are going to need if they're going to continue providing support to that student after they graduate, or what that upcoming adult is going to be needing, and what kind of agencies that they're going to need to have access to.